Emily Carter pressed her last dollar into the ticket collector's hand and did not look back at the platform. There was nothing behind her worth looking at. She was 30 years old, a widow with blistered hands, no savings, and a letter in her coat pocket from a man she had never met, a rancher in Wyoming named Jacob Turner, who needed a wife and had said so plainly in 2 paragraphs that contained no romance whatsoever and exactly one promise: she would not go hungry. That was enough. That was more than St. Louis had offered her in 2 years. If you've ever had to choose between a stranger's mercy and a city that's already forgotten your name, you already know why she got on that train. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The train out of St. Louis smelled like coal smoke and wet wool, and Emily sat with her suitcase balanced across her knees because the overhead rack above her seat had been broken since Kansas City, and nobody had come to fix it. She had been watching the country change through the window for 2 days, flat farmland, giving way to open grass giving way to something wilder and emptier than anything she had ever seen from a window in her life. She had grown up in a city. She had buried a husband in a city. She had sewn other women's wedding dresses in a city until her fingers bled and her landlord raised the rent, and she had nothing left to show for 4 years of marriage except a sewing box and a name that no longer belonged to anyone who needed her. The advertisement had appeared in the back of a newspaper she found on a bench outside the post office. Rancher widower 38, Wyoming. Seeks capable woman, mature disposition, willing to work. 6 sons. Honest arrangement. Write to J. Turner, Red Willow, Wyoming. She had read it 3 times standing on that sidewalk in the cold. 6 sons. She had read that part 4 times. Then she had gone home, sat down at her sewing table, and written the most honest letter of her life. She did not pretend to be cheerful. She did not pretend the arrangement appealed to her for romantic reasons. She told him she was 30 years old, that she had been widowed 2 years prior, that she had no children and no family within 3 states, that she could cook, sew, manage a household, keep accounts, and work without being asked twice. She told him she was not looking to be taken care of. She was looking for a place where her work meant something. He wrote back in 11 days. Come in June, train to Laramie. I'll have someone meet you. That was the whole letter. No pleased to hear from you. No looking forward to your arrival. Just an instruction and a month. She had told herself that was fine. That practical men wrote practical letters. That she was not a girl anymore and had no business expecting poetry from a stranger who was, by his own admission, simply trying to keep a household from collapsing. She had told herself that all the way from St. Louis to Laramie. She almost believed it by the time the train stopped. The man who met her at the station was not Jacob Turner. He was a ranch hand named Dex. A lean, sun-darkened man of about 50, who had clearly been given very specific instructions. Meet the woman from St. Louis, put her in the wagon drive, her to the ranch, and had decided that those instructions did not require conversation. He took her suitcase without speaking. He helped her into the wagon without speaking. He drove for 45 minutes through open country without speaking, and Emily sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and looked at Wyoming for the first time and understood with a clarity that surprised her that she had absolutely no idea what she had done. The ranch appeared at the end of a dirt road lined with dry grass. It was larger than she expected. The main house was 2 stories weathered gray by years of wind and sun, with a porch that ran the full length of the front face, and a barn behind it that was twice the size of anything she had seen on the journey in. There were horses in the corral and chickens in the yard, and 3 boys visible near the fence, who all stopped what they were doing the moment the wagon came into view. They stared at her the way people stare at something they have been warned about. Dex pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch steps, climbed down, and set her suitcase in the dirt without ceremony. "Mr. Turner's inside," he said. Those were the only words he spoke the entire trip. Emily climbed down herself, picked up her suitcase, and walked up the porch steps. The door opened before she knocked. Jacob Turner was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same rock the Wyoming hills were made of. He was not unhandsome. He was also not smiling. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he is trying to decide whether to solve or simply endure, and he said, "You're earlier than I expected." "The train was on time," Emily said. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like a reluctant acknowledgement that she had answered correctly. "Come in," he said, and stepped back from the door. The inside of the house was clean, in the way a house is clean when people have been working hard to make it presentable for company, and don't quite know what presentable looks like anymore. The floors had been swept, the table had been cleared. There was a faint smell of lye soap underneath the older smell of wood smoke and leather, and something Emily could not immediately identify, but which she would later understand was simply the accumulated smell of 7 males living in a space that had not had a woman's hand in it for 3 years. There were no boys in the main room. "Sit down," Jacob said, gesturing toward the table. "I'll get coffee." She sat. She looked around the room. There were no decorative touches, no curtains, no cloth on the table, no pictures on the wall, except a single framed photograph above the fireplace mantel. A woman, young dark-haired with a composed expression and kind eyes. She was sitting very straight in the photograph, the way people did when they knew they were being photographed and were trying to look their best. She had Jacob's same quality of stillness. Emily looked away from the photograph before Jacob came back with the coffee. He sat across from her and set a tin cup in front of her and looked at her directly for the first time. "I'll be plain," he said. "I prefer it," she said. "The house needs managing. The boys need—" He stopped, looked at his hands, started again. "The boys have been without a mother for 3 years. They've managed. But managing isn't the same as—" Another pause. "I'm not asking you to replace their mother. Nobody could do that, and nobody should try. What I'm asking is for someone capable of running this household and being present, that's all." "That's all," Emily repeated carefully. "Yes. And the marriage itself." He looked at her steadily. "Legal and proper. I'm not asking you to live here as hired help. You'll have the rights of a wife and the standing of one. What else develops between us, if anything, will be your choice as much as mine." She wrapped both hands around the tin cup. "How old are your sons?" 19, 17, 15, 13, 10, and 7. She absorbed that. 6 sons. She had read it 4 times in the advertisement, and somehow the reality of it was still larger than she had prepared for. "Do they know I'm here?" "They know." "Have you told them anything about me?" "I told them you were coming and that they would treat you with respect." "And do they intend to—" The pause before he answered was long enough to be its own answer. "They're boys," he said finally. "They'll come around." Emily nodded once and drank her coffee and said nothing more on the subject. She met all 6 of them at supper that first night. They came in from outside in order of age, washing up at the basin on the porch, and filed into the kitchen in a silence that felt practiced, like a routine they had developed to avoid any situation that might require them to speak to a stranger. The oldest, Luke 19, already carrying his father's breadth through the shoulders, with the same unreadable expression, sat at the far end of the table and looked at Emily with an assessment so open and unfriendly it was almost impressive. The next 2, Caleb and Sam, 17 and 15, sat beside each other and stared at their plates. Thomas, 13, looked at her twice with what might have been curiosity, before seeming to decide that curiosity was not appropriate and looking away. Henry, 10, sat very still and watched everything. And then there was Ben. Ben was 7 years old and small for his age, with his mother's dark hair and wide eyes that had not yet learned to hide what they were feeling. He sat down at the table last across from Emily, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression so unguarded it hurt to see it something between hope and the specific fear of a child who has already learned what hope costs. "Are you going to leave us too?" he said. The table went absolutely still. Luke's jaw tightened. Caleb stared hard at the table. Jacob, at the head of the table, went rigid in his chair. Nobody spoke. Nobody knew how to speak. The question hung over the supper table, like smoke that wouldn't clear, and every single person in that room seemed to be waiting for Emily to find a way to make it smaller than it was. She did not make it smaller. She looked at Ben directly and said, "I don't plan to." "Mama didn't plan to either," Ben said. The words weren't cruel. That was the thing that made them so hard to hear. He was 7 years old, and he was simply reporting what he understood to be true about the world, that plans didn't protect you. That people left that promising to stay was not the same as staying. "You're right," Emily said quietly. "I can't promise you something I can't guarantee. But I can tell you this, I didn't come this far to leave. I came because I have nowhere else to go, and I reckon that counts for something." Ben thought about that for a moment. Then he picked up his fork. The rest of the table slowly followed. Luke did not look at her again that night. The days that followed were not easy. Emily had expected difficulty. She had not fully expected the texture of it, the specific grinding difficulty of being an outsider in a household that had closed itself off from the inside. The boys were not cruel to her. They were something harder to fight than cruel. They were absent. They moved around her without acknowledging her, responded to direct questions with single syllables, and conducted the full business of their daily lives, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been placed in an inconvenient location and which they had all agreed to simply navigate around until someone moved it. Jacob was not unkind. He was also not present in any way that helped. He rose before dawn, worked until dark came in for supper, exhausted and largely silent, and retired early. He was not a man who understood that a household ran on more than physical labor. He understood cattle and fences and water rights and weather. He did not understand that 6 boys living under the same roof without ever speaking to each other about the things that mattered was its own kind of emergency. Emily understood it immediately. She had grown up poor enough to know that silence in a house was not peace. Silence in a house was what happened when everyone had agreed without discussing it that some things were too painful to say out loud. She had lived in a silent house after her own husband died. The silence of a woman alone with her grief in 2 rooms in St. Louis. And she knew what it cost a person to carry that silence year after year. She knew what it built up into. She watched the boys for 2 weeks before she said anything. She watched Luke come home after dark twice in 1 week, too tired for a boy who had supposedly spent the day working the ranch, and say nothing about it at supper. She watched Caleb flinch whenever Jacob raised his voice, even just to call across the yard. She watched Sam spend his evenings mending his own worn clothing, rather than asking anyone for help. She watched Thomas disappear behind the barn for an hour every afternoon, and come back red-eyed and composed. She watched Henry keep a running inventory of the pantry in a worn little notebook he carried in his breast pocket, a 10-year-old boy tracking the family's food supply because someone had to, and he had decided it would be him. And she watched Ben. Ben was the only one who talked to her. He talked to her the way children talk when they haven't yet learned to protect themselves freely, constantly, without agenda. He told her about the ranch. He told her about his brothers. He told her about his mother in the simple factual way of a child who didn't understand that some adults couldn't bear to hear it, that she had made cornbread on Sunday mornings, that she had laughed loud enough to hear from outside the barn, that she had called him her little shadow because he followed her from room to room. He told Emily all of this sitting at the kitchen table while Emily worked, and Emily listened to every word and asked questions and said nothing that she would later need to take back. It was Ben who told her without realizing what he was telling her about the recipe book. "Mama kept it on the second shelf," he said one afternoon, pointing at the kitchen shelf where a row of mismatched tins and jars were crowded together. "Behind the big blue tin. She said it had her grandmother's handwriting in it, and she wasn't going to let anybody spill on it." Emily reached behind the blue tin. The book was there. It was small and worn cloth-covered, the pages soft from years of handling. The handwriting inside changed every dozen pages or so. Different women across different generations. Recipes passed down and added to and amended in the margins. Some pages had small drawings of herbs or vegetables. One page near the back had a child's drawing of what appeared to be a chicken, rendered with great enthusiasm and limited skill, and beneath it, in adult handwriting, Ben's chicken. Don't let him see this, or he'll want credit. Emily closed the book carefully and set it on the shelf where she could see it. She did not use it immediately. She waited until the night Jacob came home to tell her in the flat tone of a man reporting a fact he wished were different that the supply order from town hadn't come in again. The pantry was low. He'd make do with what was there. He said it the way he said most things, as a statement of condition rather than a request for help, and went to wash up for supper. Emily stood in the kitchen and looked at what was on the shelf. Then she took down the recipe book and found a page toward the middle written in a hand she now recognized as the same that had captioned Ben's chicken drawing. The recipe was for a beef and potato stew, simple enough that it required almost nothing she didn't have, with a note in the margin in smaller writing, "Jacob likes extra pepper. The boys will eat anything if you put enough butter on the bread." Emily started cooking. She made the stew exactly as the recipe directed. She made the bread exactly as the margin note suggested. She set the table, not just placed the dishes, but actually set it with the cloth she found folded in the bottom drawer, and the mismatched cups arranged with a kind of care that the table had probably not seen in years. When the boys came in, Luke stopped in the doorway. He looked at the table. He looked at the pot on the stove. Something moved across his face so fast Emily almost missed it. Something young and unguarded that his 19-year-old composure immediately closed back over. "That's Ma's stew," he said. His voice was very quiet. "It is," Emily said. "I found her recipe. I hope that's all right." Luke said nothing. He walked to his place at the table and sat down. The others came in behind him, and Emily watched the same thing happen. The pause, the recognition, the swift closing off of whatever it opened. Even Jacob stopped when he came through the door and stood very still for a moment, and Emily could see him working to decide what he felt about this, and arriving at no clear conclusion. They sat down. Emily served the stew. She sat at the table herself, which she had been doing since she arrived, though the boys had not yet fully accustomed themselves to it. For a while, it was exactly like every other supper. And then Ben said, "This tastes like Sundays." Nobody answered him. "Mama always made this on Sundays," he said, "with the bread, same bread." Caleb's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "She used to sing when she made bread," Sam said suddenly, as though the words had escaped before he could decide not to say them. "That old song, the one about the river." "Shenandoah," Thomas said quietly. The table was still, not the closed-off stillness of the first night, a different kind. Something that was holding its breath, trying to decide whether it was safe to open. "She burned it once," Luke said. His voice was low and rough, and there was something in it that Emily recognized as the particular tone of a person who is about to cry and is refusing to. "First winter we were here, she burned the whole batch and cried about it for 10 minutes and then started over, and it was perfect the second time." Caleb let out a short, raw sound that was almost a laugh. "She always said the first batch was for practice," he said. "She said that about everything," Sam said. "Even the chicken that time," Thomas said. "First attempts for learning, second attempts for eating." Ben giggled. And then, for the first time since Emily had arrived at the Turner Ranch, the kitchen was full of voices. Not noise, not argument, not the careful single-syllable responses she had been receiving for 2 weeks. Voices. The 6 Turner boys talking at the same time, finishing each other's sentences, arguing about details of remembered stories. "No, she burned it twice. You weren't there. The first time I was 2. You were in the barn talking about their mother in the free, unguarded way that people talk about someone they miss when they finally feel safe enough to do it." Jacob sat at the head of the table and did not speak. He did not need to. Emily watched him and saw the thing that he was not able to say, and would not have known how to say, even if he'd been able. She saw his hands unclench on the table. She saw the line of his shoulders come down from where they had been held rigid for what looked like years. She saw him look at his 6 sons talking and laughing and fighting gently over old memories. And she saw the moment that it reached him, the full weight of what he had been holding alone in that silent house, and the full sudden relief of having it lifted just slightly, just enough. He looked up and found Emily watching him. She looked away. Neither of them said anything about it. But when supper was done, and the boys were clearing up noisily, still talking, Ben hanging on Luke's arm and making him repeat a story about their mother's first attempt at pie, Jacob paused beside Emily at the kitchen shelf and said very quietly, "Thank you." "I just followed the recipe," Emily said. Jacob looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "You didn't." He went out to check the livestock the way he did every night, and Emily stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of 6 boys washing dishes and arguing about who had kitchen duty and laughing. And she thought about the woman whose handwriting was in that book, the woman in the photograph above the fireplace, sitting straight-eyes, composed and kind, and she thought, "I'm not trying to take your place. I just want to help them carry it." The peace lasted 3 days. On the 4th morning, Emily came downstairs to find Luke at the kitchen table before dawn. He was still in his work clothes, which meant he hadn't been to bed yet, and he had a piece of paper in front of him with numbers written on it, and he covered it with his forearm the moment she came into the room. She went to the stove and built up the fire and put on the coffee without commenting on the paper or the numbers or the hour, and when she set a cup down in front of him, he looked up at her with an expression she had been watching build for 2 weeks. Not hostility exactly, more like a pressure behind a wall that was deciding whether to break or hold. "You don't have to pretend you don't see it," he said. "I'm not pretending anything," Emily said. "The ranch is in trouble," he said. The words came out flat and final, like he had been holding them so long they had calcified. "Pa won't say it, but it is. Has been for over a year. Prices dropped, the north pasture dried out last summer, and the supply cost went up, and it didn't come back down." He pushed the paper toward her. "I've been picking up work in town. Night shifts at the mill. Sam knows. Nobody else does." Emily looked at the numbers on the paper. She had kept accounts for her late husband's small tailoring shop. She knew what a troubled ledger looked like. This was a troubled ledger. "How long have you been doing the mill shifts?" she said. 8 months. "Does your father know?" Luke's jaw tightened. "No." "Why not?" "Because he's already working himself half to death, and if I tell him I'm taking night shifts to cover what the cattle aren't making, he'll just work more." He looked at her steadily. "And because I'm 19 and I can handle it." "You're also not sleeping," Emily said. "I'm fine." "You covered those numbers before I could see them." "That's my business. You showed them to me the moment I didn't react the way you expected," Emily said, "which tells me you've been waiting for someone to show them to." Luke stared at her. He was 19 years old, and he had been carrying the weight of a grown man's financial worry for 8 months, and he had done it alone because he loved his father and his brothers and didn't know another way to love them except to carry things without complaining. Emily recognized that particular kind of love. She had grown up with it. She had practiced it herself. "Your pa needs to know," she said. "It'll kill him." "No," Emily said carefully. "Carrying it alone is what's killing things." Luke looked at the numbers. "What do you know about ranching?" he said, and it wasn't quite contemptuous, more like a genuine question wrapped in the last defense of a tired boy. "Nothing," Emily said. "But I know accounts, and I know a household. And I know that what's been going on in this house isn't 7 people building a life. It's 7 people surviving separately under the same roof." The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove. Luke looked at her for a long time. "Supper was good," he said finally. "The stew." "Your mother's recipe," Emily said. "I know." He picked up the coffee cup. "She would have—" He stopped. "She was good at making people talk. At the table. She always said the table was the one place you had to actually show up." "She was right," Emily said. Luke wrapped both hands around the cup and stared into it for a moment that felt very long. "I'll think about telling Pa," he said. "That's all I'm asking," Emily said. She left him at the table with his coffee and his numbers and went to start the morning biscuits, and outside the window, the sky was just beginning to go pale at the edges, and the ranch was waking up slow and quiet around her. The horses moving in the corral, a rooster starting up somewhere near the barn, and somewhere between the fire in the stove and the flour in the bowl, Emily Carter allowed herself to feel for the first time since she stepped off that train. Something that was not quite belonging, and not quite hope, but was the fragile beginning of both. Luke did not tell Jacob that morning. He folded the paper with the numbers on it, tucked it into his shirt pocket, finished his coffee, and went out to start the day's work before the other boys came downstairs. Emily watched him go and did not push. She had said what needed saying. The rest was his to carry to the door. But something had shifted between them, thin as the first ice on a water trough. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. Luke stopped looking through her at meals. He didn't speak to her directly, didn't suddenly become warm or open. But when she set his coffee down in the mornings, he nodded at her, and when Ben climbed onto her lap at supper one evening without asking, Luke watched it happen and said nothing, which from him was almost an endorsement. The other boys were slower. Caleb, 17, was the one who worried Emily most in those early weeks. He was quiet in a way that was different from his brother's quiet, not guarded, not distant, but watchful, coiled like a boy, waiting for something bad to happen so he could say he'd been expecting it. He flinched at sudden sounds. He apologized for things that weren't his fault. When Jacob raised his voice across the yard one afternoon, not in anger, just calling to Dex about a fence line, Caleb's whole body went rigid for a second, before he caught himself and kept walking. Emily filed that away and said nothing. Sam, 15, was the one who surprised her. He had seemed indifferent to her in the first 2 weeks, one of the middle ground boys who neither resisted her nor accepted her. But she found him one evening sitting on the porch steps with one of his shirts in his lap and a needle in his hand, trying to repair a tear at the shoulder seam, with the careful, frustrated concentration of someone doing a job they haven't been taught properly. He had pulled the thread too tight and puckered the fabric, and was close to either fixing it or ruining it entirely. "You want help with that?" Emily said. Sam looked up. "I'm fine." "You've pulled the tension too tight. You'll tear it worse if you keep going." He looked at the shirt. He looked at her. He handed it over with the particular reluctant dignity of a teenage boy accepting help he didn't want to need. She sat beside him on the steps and showed him how to loosen the thread and restitch the seam properly. And while she worked, he watched her hands with the concentrated attention of a boy who was actually learning something rather than just waiting for her to finish. When she handed it back and told him he could do the next one himself, he looked at the repaired seam for a moment and then said without looking up, "Ma used to say a good seam is the thing that holds everything together." "She was right," Emily said. Sam nodded, once stood up and went back inside. It wasn't much, but Emily understood by then that in this household nothing was small. Everything was a test and everything was a door, and the only way through was to keep showing up at every one of them. 3 weeks in, she found Henry's notebook. Not found. Henry left it on the kitchen table one morning, with the cover facing up, and went outside, which Emily understood was not an accident. She sat down and opened it, and read 12 pages of careful 10-year-old handwriting, tracking the ranch's food stores, cross-referenced with the days of the week, and small notations about what had run out, and what was running low, and what they were completely out of, and had been for a while. The boy had been doing this for months. She was still sitting with the notebook when Henry came back inside, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression that was braced for something reproach or dismissal, or the particular adult response of being told that something a child was doing was not their concern. "You've been keeping this for how long?" Emily said. "Since last fall," Henry said carefully, "when the flour ran out the second time and nobody noticed for 4 days. Does your father know you're doing this?" "No, ma'am." "Does Luke?" A pause. "Luke knows some of it." Emily closed the notebook and set it down on the table. "Henry, this is good work. Careful work. Most grown men I've known couldn't keep an account this clean." Henry blinked. He had clearly not prepared for that response. "I just didn't want us to run out of things again," he said quietly. "I know," Emily said. "Come sit down. Show me the system you're using." He sat across from her, and they spent an hour going through the notebook together, and by the end, Henry was talking fast and earnest about storage rotation and seasonal prices, and what items could be substituted for what. And Emily was genuinely listening, because the boy was genuinely sharp, and when Jacob came in for the midday meal, he found his 10-year-old son and his new wife bent over a notebook at the kitchen table, arguing cheerfully about whether cornmeal or flour was the more critical staple to stockpile, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression Emily didn't see because her back was to him. But Henry saw it. Henry looked at his father's face, and something in his own face went very still and careful, and he glanced quickly at Emily and back at Jacob, and Emily, feeling the shift in Henry's attention, turned around. Jacob said, "That's Henry's food book." "It is," Emily said. "He's been keeping track of the pantry since last fall. You've got a son with a head for accounts, Jacob." Something moved through Jacob's expression that she couldn't quite read. Pride tangled up with something harder, something that looked almost like shame. He looked at Henry and said, "That right." Henry lifted his chin. "Somebody had to." The 3 words landed heavier than the boy intended them to, or maybe exactly as heavy as he intended them to. Jacob held his son's gaze for a long moment and then looked away first, which was its own kind of answer. He sat down at the table. He didn't ask to see the notebook. He didn't say anything about it at all. But at supper that night, he asked Henry to help him figure out the supply order for the next month, and Henry sat up straighter than Emily had seen him sit since she'd arrived. And Luke across the table caught Emily's eye for the first fraction of a second and looked away again before either of them had to acknowledge what had just happened. The crack in the wall was small, but it was there. It widened the following week in a way nobody planned. Emily had been trying to understand the ranch's finances without asking directly, because she'd already learned that asking Jacob directly about money produced the same result as asking a granite cliff to move. Not hostility, just absolute immovability. So she listened. She watched. She read between the lines of conversations she was not invited into and added what Henry's notebook told her to what she could see with her own eyes, and what she built up was a picture that made the unease she'd felt since arriving sharpen into something more focused and cold. The ranch was not simply struggling. It was being squeezed. She didn't have a name for it yet, but she had a feeling. It started with the supply deliveries. The first one she'd witnessed had been short items ordered and not delivered with no explanation. She'd assumed it was ordinary supply chain trouble, the kind of thing that happened on the frontier when you were dependent on a single merchant in a town 30 miles away. But the second delivery was short, 2 different items, same lack of explanation. And when she mentioned it to Jacob, the line of his jaw went hard, in a way that told her this was not news to him. "Harlan's been unreliable," was all he said. "Harlan's the supply merchant. Only one in Red Willow." Emily thought about that. "Is there another town close enough to use a different merchant?" Jacob looked at her. "Why would we need a different merchant?" She let it go for the moment. But she asked Dex about it the next morning, because Dex talked to her in the same minimal way he talked to everyone, and therefore could be trusted not to editorialize. She asked him casually whether the supply shortages were recent or had been happening for a while. Dex squinted at the middle distance. "About 8 months, he said. 8 months, the same length of time Luke had been working night shifts at the mill." She stood there in the yard and felt the pieces settle into a shape she didn't like. That afternoon, she drove herself into Red Willow in the small wagon alone without telling Jacob. She had her own reasons for going, and she wasn't ready to explain them. She told Ben she was going for thread and sugar and would be back before supper, and Ben told her to bring him a penny candy, and she said she'd see what she could do. Red Willow was a small town main street, maybe 15 buildings of consequence. The rest scattered outwards in the practical, unsentimental way of frontier settlements. She tied the horse at the post outside the supply merchants and went in and introduced herself to Harlan, who was a heavy-set man with careful eyes and a manner that was professional without being warm. She bought thread and sugar and a penny candy for Ben, and while Harlan was wrapping her order, she said conversationally, I understand there's been some trouble with deliveries out to the Turner Ranch. Harlan's hands didn't stop moving. Supply lines get complicated. For 8 months. He looked up at her then. Freight costs have gone up. Emily said. And is that the same reason the Dawson Ranch and the Ketterly place have been having trouble with their deliveries? She didn't actually know whether the Dawson Ranch or the Ketterly place were having trouble. She'd invented them as a test. Harlan said, I wouldn't know about that, which told her nothing. But the way he said it, the careful practiced neutrality of a man who had been coached to say nothing, told her something else entirely. She took her order and drove back to the ranch and sat in the kitchen after supper, going through Henry's notebook again. And this time, she wasn't looking at the food inventory. She was looking at the pattern. The things that ran short. The things that ran out completely. The things that had been running short since roughly 8 months ago, in a pattern that was too consistent to be random bad luck and too targeted to be simple commercial trouble. Someone was applying pressure. She didn't know yet who. She didn't know yet why. But by the time Jacob came in from the evening check, she had a list of questions she needed answered, and she had decided quietly, and without drama, that she was going to find the answers whether Jacob wanted her to or not. She waited until the boys were in bed. Jacob was at the table with his boots off and a cup of cold coffee in front of him, going through papers in the dull, mechanical way of a man too tired to think clearly, but unable to make himself stop. Emily sat across from him and put Henry's notebook on the table between them. Jacob looked at it. Emily, I'm not going to fight with you, she said. I'm going to ask you one question, and I want a straight answer. He looked at her. Is someone deliberately making it difficult for this ranch to operate? The silence that followed was long enough and complete enough to be its own answer. Jacob. There's a man, Jacob said finally, in the tone of a man releasing something he's been holding underwater. Walter Briggs. He's been buying up land in this valley for 2 years. Ranches that go under mostly. He buys the land at bottom price and consolidates it. And he wants your land. He made an offer 18 months ago. I said no. And 8 months ago, the supply trouble started. Jacob looked at the notebook. You figured that out. Henry figured out half of it, Emily said. He just didn't have the piece about Briggs to connect it to. Jacob rubbed his face with one hand. I didn't want to worry the boys. Luke's been working night shifts at the mill for 8 months to help cover the difference, Emily said. Jacob's hand dropped. What? He didn't tell you. He didn't want you to worry. She kept her voice even. Your 19-year-old son has been doing night shifts at the mill, and your 10-year-old son has been tracking the food supply in a notebook, and neither one of them told you because they didn't want to add to what you were already carrying. Jacob sat very still. I didn't know, he said. The words came out rough, stripped of their usual flatness. I know you didn't, Emily said. That's the problem. He looked at her sharply. I don't mean that as a criticism, she said carefully. I mean that you're in this house with 6 boys and every single one of you is carrying something alone, and none of you know what the others are carrying because nobody in this house has sat down and actually talked since their mother died. She paused. You've kept this ranch standing. You've kept them fed and housed and working. You've done everything a man is supposed to do. But Jacob, they need more than the ranch to be standing. He didn't answer. The clock on the wall measured the silence between them. Briggs, she said finally, coming back to the ground she needed him on. What does he want specifically? The water access, Jacob said, his voice returning to its more familiar flatness, the practical register he retreated to when the other one became too exposed. This ranch sits on the only natural spring in this part of the valley. Whoever controls this land controls the water for about 4 surrounding properties. Briggs has 3 of those properties already. He gets mine, and he controls the water to the whole valley. Emily absorbed that. And he's willing to starve you out to get it. He's willing to make it hard enough that I'll eventually have no choice. Does anyone else in town know what he's doing? People suspect. Nobody's willing to say it out loud. Briggs runs the land office. He's got connections to the county seat. Jacob looked at her steadily. He's not doing anything that's technically against the law, Emily. That's the problem. It's not theft. It's pressure. Pressure can be countered, Emily said. Not by one man with a failing cattle operation and 6 boys to feed. Emily looked at Henry's notebook. She thought about Luke's numbers on the paper he'd been hiding. She thought about Sam mending his own shirts, and Henry tracking the pantry, and Caleb flinching at loud sounds, and all the silent, careful, exhausted management this family had been doing of a crisis none of them would name out loud. No, she said, not by one man. She looked up at Jacob. But you're not one man, she said. You've got neighbors. You said Briggs has 3 of the surrounding properties, which means there's at least one owner he hasn't gotten to yet. And if he's doing to them what he's doing to you, they won't want to talk about it either. They'll talk to me, Emily said quietly. People talk to me. I'm not threatening to anyone. She paused. Let me go talk to the Dawsons. And the Ketterleys. Jacob stared at her. You invented those names in Harlan's shop today. She had not told him she'd gone to town. How do you know I was at Harlan's shop? Harlan mentioned it. Jacob's expression was unreadable. He said a woman from the Turner Ranch came in asking questions about delivery trouble. Good, Emily said. Then Briggs already knows I'm paying attention. That might actually be useful. Emily. Jacob's voice carried something unfamiliar. Not warning exactly, not anger. Something closer to the sound of a man looking at a situation he cannot control and trying to decide whether that frightens him or relieves him. This is not a safe man to cross. I'm not planning to cross him, Emily said. I'm planning to make it difficult for him to keep doing what he's doing without anyone seeing it. She met his eyes. There's a difference. Jacob looked at her for a long moment. You've been here less than a month, he said. I know. You came here to run a household. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, Emily said. And this is my household now. And I don't intend to let someone take it. The word my sat between them in the lamplight, and Emily felt the weight of it herself, the surprise of it, the truth of it. She had not planned to mean it that much. But she did. Jacob looked down at his coffee cup. He looked at Henry's notebook. He looked at the hands of a woman who had shown up on his porch with a single suitcase and no illusions, and had spent 4 weeks quietly learning everything about his family that he had failed to see. All right, he said finally. 2 words. Quiet as the house around them, but they changed the shape of everything that came after. Jacob kept his word. He did not suddenly become a different man overnight. Emily had not expected him to. He was still up before dawn, and out the door before most of the boys had their boots on, still more comfortable with fence posts and water lines than with conversations that required him to sit still and feel something. But he stopped leaving her out. When Dex brought news from town, Jacob told her what it was. When the week's supply order came back short again, this time missing the grain they needed for the horses, he came and found her, instead of absorbing it alone and saying nothing at supper. Small changes. But in a household that had been running on silence for 3 years, small changes echoed. Emily had been thinking hard about the neighbors. She knew from Jacob that the Pattersons still held their land 2 miles east, one of the 4 surrounding properties Briggs had not yet acquired. Ed Patterson was 62, had ranched the same acreage for 20 years, and according to Jacob, had not been to town in 3 months. Jacob said it without inflection the way he said most things. Emily heard it the way she heard everything Jacob said, without inflection, as information he did not know he was giving her. A man who stopped going to town was either sick broke or being made to feel unwelcome. She drove out to the Patterson Ranch on a Tuesday morning with a jar of preserves and no agenda she was willing to name out loud, and she found Ed Patterson's wife Ruth hanging laundry in the yard, with the tight-shouldered efficiency of a woman who had learned not to waste motion on feelings. Ruth was 60, iron-haired with hands like Emily's own, rough and practical, the hands of someone who had worked every day of their adult life. Ruth looked at the jar of preserves and then at Emily and said, "You're the woman Jacob Turner married." "I am," Emily said. "Word got to town fast," Ruth said. It was not quite an accusation. "Word usually does," Emily said. "Can I help you with those sheets?" Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she handed over half the laundry without ceremony, and they worked side by side for 10 minutes before either of them said anything that mattered. It was Ruth who went first. "Ed got a letter last week," she said, clipping a corner of sheet to the line with more force than the task required. "From the land office. Said there was a question about our water rights documentation. Said we needed to provide original survey records from 1871 or the rights would be subject to review." Emily kept her hands moving. "And do you have the original records?" "We had them," Ruth said. "Ed sent them to the county seat 6 years ago when there was a boundary dispute with the north fence line. They were supposed to send them back." Her jaw was set hard. They didn't. And now the land office wants records that are sitting in a county office somewhere and can't be produced on demand. That's about the size of it. Emily finished the sheet she was holding and reached for the next one. "Has Ed talked to anyone about it?" "Who's he going to talk to?" "Briggs runs the land office." Ruth's voice was flat with a fury she was keeping very carefully controlled. "My husband's been ranching this land since before Walter Briggs could spell his own name. Now some paper-pushing speculator is going to tell him his water rights are in question. He's doing the same thing to Jacob," Emily said. "Not the same method, but the same pressure. Deliveries going short, prices getting manipulated, making it harder and harder to operate until selling looks like the reasonable choice." Ruth stopped working. She turned and looked at Emily directly for the first time, and Emily saw in her face the same thing she had seen in Luke's face that morning at the kitchen table, the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just realized they're not the only one. "How many others?" Ruth said. "I don't know yet," Emily said. "That's why I'm here." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Hendersons. South Pasture Side. Clara Henderson told me in April that their contract with the cattle buyer got canceled without explanation. They'd had that contract for 11 years. Emily filed that away. "Anyone else?" "Milt Garber lost his lease on the grazing land by the creek last spring. Briggs bought it from the estate of the previous owner before the ink was dry on the death notice." Ruth picked up the laundry basket and looked at Emily with an expression that had gone from wariness to something harder and more purposeful. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Emily said carefully, "that one rancher refusing to sell is an inconvenience to Briggs. But 4 or 5 ranchers who all know what he's doing and can document it, that's something else. Document it how he hasn't broken any laws." "Not individually," Emily said. "But a pattern is different from an incident, and patterns can be shown to people who have the authority to care about them." She paused. "Does Ed know a lawyer?" Ruth's expression shifted into something Emily couldn't quite read. Not quite hope too guarded for that, but the shape of a woman who is beginning to consider that hope might not be entirely foolish. "There's a man in Cheyenne," Ruth said slowly. "Ed went to school with him. Haven't spoken in years." "Write to him," Emily said. "Tell him what's happening. Ask him what documentation you'd need to make a case." She met Ruth's eyes steadily. "Don't send the letter from Red Willow. If Briggs has connections at the land office, he may have connections at the post office too." Ruth stared at her. "You think he'd interfere with mail? I think he's already interfering with supply deliveries and water rights documentation," Emily said. "I don't know what else he's capable of, but I'd rather be careful and wrong than careless and right." Ruth picked up her laundry basket. She looked at Emily for a long moment with the evaluating expression of a woman deciding whether to trust someone she barely knew, weighing the accumulated evidence of a single morning against the accumulated caution of 60 years. "Come inside," she said finally. "I'll put coffee on." Emily came inside. She was back at the Turner Ranch by early afternoon, and she went straight to the kitchen table with a piece of paper and started writing down everything. Ruth had told her. The land office letter, the missing survey records, the Henderson contract cancellation, Milt Garber's lost lease, building out the pattern she'd felt since the beginning into something with shape and weight and specificity. She was so absorbed in it that she didn't hear Luke come in until he was standing beside the table, looking at the paper over her shoulder. She looked up. He was reading her notes. His expression was unreadable, in the way his expressions always were, but his eyes were moving fast across the page. "Briggs sent a letter to the Pattersons about their water rights," he said. "You knew about the Pattersons." "I talked to Ed Patterson's hired man at the mill." Luke pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "He said Ed's been losing sleep over it. Said it came out of nowhere." "It didn't come out of nowhere," Emily said. "It's coordinated." Luke was quiet for a moment. "Pa knows it's coordinated. Your father told me about Briggs 2 nights ago." Something crossed Luke's face. Not anger, more like the complicated emotion of learning that a thing you'd been protecting someone from had already reached them. "He didn't say anything to us." "He was trying to protect you," Emily said. "Same reason I didn't tell him about the mill shifts," Luke said, and the irony of it landed on him visibly, a man recognizing his own behavior in someone else's. "Yes," Emily said simply. Luke looked at her notes again. "What are you going to do?" "Build a record," Emily said. "Every ranch affected, every incident, every date. Make the pattern visible. And then find someone with authority who's willing to look at it." "Briggs has connections at the county seat." "Briggs has connections at the county seat," Emily agreed. "But the county seat isn't the only authority that exists. There are land rights attorneys in Cheyenne. There are federal land office inspectors. There are newspaper reporters who cover the territory." She looked at Luke steadily. "He's counting on everyone dealing with this alone. The moment people start talking to each other, his strategy falls apart." Luke absorbed that. He was quiet for long enough that Emily thought he might stand up and leave the way he usually did when a conversation moved into territory he wasn't ready for. Instead, he said, "I should have told Pa about the mill shifts." Emily waited. "I kept thinking—" He stopped, started again. "After Ma died, Pa just kept working. That's all he did. Worked and worked and worked, like if he worked hard enough, the grief would run out eventually. And we all just—" He rubbed the back of his neck. "We all just did the same. Picked something to hold on to and held it until our hands went numb. Mine was the money. Henry's was the food. Sam just fixed things. Thomas went behind the barn." He looked at the table. "Ben cried. He's the only one who actually did what you're supposed to do. He was young enough that nobody taught him not to," Emily said quietly. Luke made a sound that was almost a laugh, but didn't quite arrive. "Pa doesn't know how to say things. He never did. Ma was the one who—" He stopped again. "She was the one who made you say it. You couldn't be in the same room as her and hold something back. She looked at you a certain way and it came out." "I saw her picture," Emily said. "She would have liked you," Luke said, and it came out rough and unprepared, like something he hadn't planned to say and couldn't now take back. He stood up abruptly and went to the door. "I'll talk to Pa tonight," he said without turning around. "About the mill. He should know." "Yes," Emily said. "He should." Luke went out. Emily sat at the kitchen table with her notes and felt the particular quiet of a house that was beginning slowly and painfully and imperfectly to do the thing it had not done in 3 years, let things through. She did not have long to sit with it. The peace broke 4 days later, and when it broke fast and hard in the way things do when they have been holding past their limit. It started with the water. Jacob came in at midday with a look on his face that Emily had not seen before. Not the flat exhaustion she'd become accustomed to. Not even the tight-jawed worry he wore when the finances were on his mind. But something rawer and more urgent. A man who has just discovered something he wasn't prepared for. "The North Creek feed is blocked," he said. "Upstream. Somebody dammed it." Emily set down what she was holding. "Briggs. Nothing I can prove. But the dam is on land he bought from Milt Garber." Jacob's voice was very controlled. "Without that creek feed, the North pasture cattle have no water. I've got 4 days, maybe 5, before I have to move them or start losing animals." "Move them where?" "South pasture. But the South pasture's already carrying its load. I crowd them in together in this heat, and I'm going to have sick cattle on top of everything else." He looked at her directly. "He's pushing harder. He found out I talked to Ruth Patterson, Emily said. Jacob's jaw tightened. That's what I think. He's trying to force a decision before I can build anything, she said. She kept her voice steady, because one of them had to be. How much time do we actually have, not just the cattle, the whole operation, if nothing changes? How much time? Jacob looked at her for a long moment. 6 weeks. Maybe 8. 6 weeks. She had been building towards something slow and careful, and Briggs had just cut her timeline in half. She was still working through the implications of that when Thomas came in through the back door at a near run, and Thomas was the boy who went behind the barn to cry alone and never ran. So the fact that he was running now brought Emily to her feet before he'd said a single word. "Luke and Caleb," Thomas said, breathing hard. "They're in the yard. It's bad." They had been arguing for 20 minutes by the time Emily and Jacob got outside, and it was the kind of argument that had clearly been building for months, maybe years, the kind that starts with one thing and almost immediately stops being about that thing at all. It had started, Sam told them later, with the mill shifts. Luke had told Jacob at supper the previous night, kept his word just as he'd said he would, and Jacob had reacted the way Jacob reacted to most things that cut close, which was to go very still and say very little. But Caleb had heard it, and Caleb had not gone still. Caleb had gone to bed, and apparently spent the night working himself up to something, and the something had come out in the yard that morning like water through a broken dam. "You think you're the only one who did anything?" Caleb was saying, his voice shaking with an emotion that was bigger than the argument, bigger than anything he usually let out. "You've been telling yourself that story for 2 years, Luke. That you're the one holding everything together. That nobody else was doing anything. I'm not saying that. You didn't ask me," Caleb said. 8 months of night shifts, and you didn't ask me once if I could help. "You're 17. I'm big enough to work same as you." Caleb's voice cracked on the last word, and he pushed through it. "You treat me like I'm still 10 years old, and you just decided on your own to carry it all and let the rest of us stand there feeling useless. I was trying to protect you." Luke's voice had gone quiet and hard. "I don't want to be protected." Caleb was almost shouting now. "I want to be trusted. There's a difference." Jacob stepped forward. "Boys, he does it to all of us," Caleb said, and now he was looking at Jacob, and his voice had changed into something more frightened and more honest than the anger. "You both do. You and Luke. You carry everything alone, and you never ask us, and we just stand there not knowing what's happening and feeling like we're not. His voice broke. The yard went very still. "Like you're not part of it," Emily said. Caleb looked at her. His face was that of a 17-year-old boy who had been bracing for impact and received something else entirely. "Yeah," he said barely above a whisper. "Like I'm not part of it." Jacob stood very still. The kind of stillness that was not composure, but its opposite, a man going absolutely motionless because he was not sure what would happen if he moved. "I didn't know you felt that way," Jacob said finally. His voice was rough. "You didn't ask," Caleb said. And that was the moment the whole argument changed. Not resolved, it was nowhere near resolved. But the anger drained out of Caleb's face and left something exposed and young underneath it. And Luke stood there, with his hands at his sides, looking at his younger brother with an expression that was part guilt and part recognition, and part the particular grief of realizing you have been so busy protecting someone that you forgot to see them. Ben appeared in the doorway. He looked at his father and his 2 oldest brothers standing in the yard in charged silence, and then he looked at Emily and said with the unerring instinct of a 7-year-old, "Is everybody going to be okay?" Emily looked at Jacob. Jacob looked at his sons. Luke looked at Caleb. "Yeah, buddy," Luke said finally, his voice unsteady. "We're working on it." But the fracture had shown itself, and it was wider than any of them had known. That evening Sam came to Emily where she was sitting on the porch after the younger boys had gone to bed, and he sat beside her without preamble, and said without looking at her, "Luke and Caleb aren't the only ones." Emily waited. I blame Pa, Sam said. Not for Ma dying. I know that's not his fault. He picked at a loose board on the step. But after, he closed off. He stopped talking to us about her like she'd never existed and just worked and worked, and I kept waiting for him to... He stopped. I kept waiting for him to look at me and say something. Anything. Just to say he knew we were all hurting too. He never did. He was hurting too, Emily said carefully. I know that, Sam said, and his voice held the frustrated compassion of a 15-year-old who understood something intellectually that still felt like abandonment emotionally. I know, but knowing it doesn't... He shook his head. I used to think maybe he blamed us for being alive when she wasn't. Emily felt that land with its full weight. He doesn't, she said. How do you know? Because I've watched him look at all 6 of you every day for 4 weeks, Emily said. And the look on his face isn't blame. It's grief that doesn't know how to be grief in front of people. Sam was quiet for a long moment. He needs to say that to us. He does, Emily said. And I think he's getting close to being able to. Sam nodded once the way he always did, that small, precise acknowledgement that was his version of acceptance. He stood up. The Briggs thing, he said. Luke told me. What can I do? Emily looked at him, 15 years old, steady as iron, asking what he could do. Can you ride to the Henderson Ranch tomorrow? She said. I need to talk to Clara Henderson, and I can't leave the younger boys again so soon. I can ride anywhere you need, Sam said. He went back inside. Emily sat on the porch alone in the dark and thought about 6 boys and 1 man and 3 years of silence and all the things that had been building underneath it. And she thought about Briggs with his damned creek and his land office connections and his careful, legal, methodical destruction. And she thought about 6 weeks and what 6 weeks actually meant when everything you needed to build was this fragile and this urgent at the same time. Something had to give, and she was no longer entirely sure whether it would be Briggs first or the Turner family. The morning after Sam offered to ride to the Hendersons, Emily woke before anyone else and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, with her notes spread out in front of her and the weight of everything she knew pressing down on her chest like a stone. 6 weeks. She kept coming back to that number. Jacob had said it with the flat certainty of a man who had already done the math 100 times and arrived at the same answer every time. 6 weeks before the operation became unsustainable. Before the choice stopped being a choice and became simply a fact. Briggs knew that number too. She was certain of it. The dam on the North Creek hadn't been an accident of timing. It had been a calculation. He had watched the pressure build for 8 months and then applied the 1 additional weight he knew would start the collapse. Take the water. Force the cattle south. Create a crisis on top of a crisis and let the math do the rest. She picked up her pen and wrote 1 line at the top of her notes. He wins if we move slowly. He loses if we move together. Then she went and built up the fire and started the biscuits and waited for the house to wake up. Sam rode to the Hendersons that morning as promised, and he came back in the early afternoon with Clara Henderson herself sitting beside him in her wagon. A spare direct woman of about 55 who tied her horse at the post and walked into Emily's kitchen with the expression of someone who had run out of patience for going slowly. Sam says you're building a record, Clara said before she'd fully sat down. I am, Emily said. Our cattle contract was canceled 11 months ago. Buyer claimed the quality didn't meet standard. We'd sold to that buyer for 11 years with no complaints. Clara's voice was precise and controlled, and contained a fury so compressed it had become a kind of fuel. 3 months later, we found out Briggs had purchased a 20% stake in that buying operation. Emily wrote it down. Do you have any documentation of the original contract? I have every contract going back 15 years, Clara said. Ed Patterson brought over his land grant records yesterday, Ruth wrote to us. We've been comparing what we have. She paused. Milt Garber's widow is willing to testify about the lease. She says Briggs contacted them the week before her husband died. Before he died, Emily. Like he knew. The kitchen went very quiet. "That's not proof of anything," Emily said carefully. "No," Clara said, "but it's a pattern." She looked at Emily steadily. "Ruth said you mentioned a lawyer in Cheyenne." "I mentioned the idea of one. I don't have a contact." "I do," Clara said. "My brother-in-law practices land rights law out of Cheyenne. I've already written to him." She reached into her coat and placed a folded letter on the table. He wrote back. "He says what you're describing: coordinated interference with supply chains, manipulation of land office documentation, conflict of interest in the cattle buying is potentially actionable under federal land protection statutes if it can be shown to be a deliberate pattern rather than coincidence." Emily picked up the letter and read it. Her hands were very steady. "He needs sworn statements," she said, "from each family, written, dated, signed. And he needs the documentation, every contract, every canceled order, every letter from the land office." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I drove over today instead of writing." She looked at Emily directly. "How do we do this without Briggs finding out before we're ready?" Emily thought about Ruth's caution, about the post office in Red Willow, about the careful, legal, patient way Briggs operated, and the fact that he had moved to dam the creek within days of Emily's visit to the Patterson Ranch. "We don't use Red Willow for anything," Emily said. "Mail goes out of Laramie. Meetings happen here or at the Patterson place, not in town. We document everything, but we say nothing in public until the lawyer is ready to file." She paused. "And we need to move fast. We have maybe 5 weeks before the Turner operation hits the wall." Clara nodded once, the firm, decisive nod of a woman who had been waiting for someone to tell her there was a plan. "I'll contact the Garbers. Ruth has the Hendersons on the south side. Who else?" "I need to find out who else Briggs has been pressuring that we don't know about yet," Emily said. "There may be families who haven't said anything because they don't know others are dealing with the same thing." "The Moores," Clara said immediately. "West of the creek. They stopped coming to the community meeting in March. No explanation? I thought it was just Tom Moore being Tom Moore, but now... Can you reach them?" "Their daughter and my daughter are friends. I can reach them." Emily looked at the letter from the lawyer. She looked at her notes. She thought about the shape of what was being built slowly, carefully in kitchens and on wagon rides, rather than in courtrooms, but building nonetheless into something real. "Clara," she said, "thank you for coming." Clara stood up and straightened her coat. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when Briggs is standing in front of a federal land inspector trying to explain himself." She picked up her gloves. "I'll be back Thursday with the Garber widow and whatever documentation I can carry." She drove out, and Emily stood on the porch and watched her go, and felt for the first time in weeks something that was less like urgency and more like momentum. She needed that feeling to last exactly long enough to get through what was coming. What was coming arrived the next morning in the form of a letter. It was addressed to Jacob from the Red Willow Land Office, and it arrived with the supply wagon that was still delivering short orders and had now apparently added bureaucratic harassment to its service. Jacob read it at the kitchen table while Emily poured coffee, and she watched his face go through 3 distinct expressions in about 4 seconds: confusion, comprehension, and a cold, controlled anger that was more frightening than shouting would have been. He handed her the letter without speaking. It was formal and official, and written in the careful language of a document designed to sound routine while describing something that was not routine at all. It stated that a review of water rights documentation for the Turner property had identified a discrepancy in the original 1874 land grant survey. Pending clarification of the boundary markers on the northeast corner of the property, water rights to the North Creek access were being placed under administrative review. The review process was expected to take 60 to 90 days. During the review period, use of the North Creek water access was subject to restriction. 60 to 90 days. Jacob didn't have 6 weeks. He certainly didn't have 90 days. "He's filing paper on the water rights," Emily said. "While the creek's already dammed," Jacob said. "He's covering himself legally at the same time he's doing it physically." His voice was absolutely flat. "By the time any review process concludes, I'll have lost animals. I won't be able to sustain the operation. and he'll make an offer on the property at the exact moment I'm not able to say no. He's done this before, Emily said. The Pattersons' water rights review, Ruth told me. Same kind of letter. The Pattersons are still here, Jacob said, because Ed hasn't gotten to the point of crisis yet. Briggs is applying pressure to all of them at different rates. He moves you to crisis first because you're the water source. Once he has this land, the others become trivial. Jacob stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she could see the tension through his entire body, the posture of a man holding himself together through sheer discipline. "Jacob," she said. He didn't turn around. "We have what we need," she said. "The lawyer in Cheyenne, Clara Henderson's brother-in-law, he says this is actionable. We have documentation from 4 families. We have the pattern. We just need to get it to him." "In how long?" "Clara comes Thursday with the Garbers. If we can get sworn statements drafted this week and have Sam ride them to Laramie by Saturday." "That's 9 days before I have to start moving cattle," Jacob said. "If the lawyer files immediately, if the federal land office responds immediately, Emily, none of that moves as fast as cattle die." "I know," she said. "Which is why the legal action is one part of it, not all of it." He turned around then. "What's the other part?" he said. Emily looked at him steadily. "The other part is making what Briggs is doing visible. Not just to a lawyer. To people. To the community. To anyone who reads a newspaper, or attends a county meeting, or cares about what kind of territory Wyoming becomes." She paused. Ruth mentioned a man named Gordon Walsh, who writes for the territorial paper in Cheyenne. She says he's been looking for a story about land consolidation in the valley for 2 years, but hasn't been able to get anyone on record. "You want to talk to a newspaper reporter?" Jacob said. "I want someone to talk to a newspaper reporter," Emily said. "Clara, Ruth, the Garbers, any of them, all of them. On record, with documentation." She held his gaze. "Briggs is counting on silence. He's counting on everyone being too scared or too proud or too isolated to speak. The moment it's in print, the moment people outside this valley know what's happening, his ability to operate quietly disappears." Jacob looked at her for a long moment. "This could make him move faster," Jacob said. "If he thinks he's about to be exposed, he might push harder before we're ready." "Yes," Emily said. "That's the risk." She did not minimize it. She did not dress it up. She gave him the risk clean and straight because he was not a man who responded to anything less than the unvarnished truth. "And you think it's worth taking," he said. "I think the alternative is waiting and losing," she said. "And I didn't come here to lose." Jacob looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank what was in it and set it back down with a sound that was almost decisive. "All right," he said for the second time since she'd arrived. The same 2 words. The same weight behind them. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to call your sons together tonight," Emily said. "All of them, at the supper table, and I need you to tell them everything." Jacob went still. "Everything," she said. "The finances, Briggs, the letter, the timeline, all of it. They're not children. Jacob, not even Ben, is as young as you think he is when it comes to this family. They've been carrying pieces of this alone for months. They deserve to carry it together." "They'll be scared," Jacob said. "They're already scared," Emily said. "They're just scared alone." He held her gaze for a long time. Then he nodded. Supper that night was different from any supper that had come before it. Jacob waited until everyone had eaten, until the plates were mostly empty, and the table had settled into its familiar end-of-meal quiet. And then he put down his fork and looked at each of his sons in turn and said, "I need to talk to all of you about something, and I need you to let me get through it before you say anything." The table went absolutely still. Jacob talked for 20 minutes. He told them about Briggs and the water rights and the supply chain interference. He told them about the letter that had come that morning. He told them about the 6-week timeline and what it meant. He did not soften any of it. He did not translate it into something easier to hear. He sat at the head of the table and looked at his sons and told them the truth about the state of the thing they all lived inside, and Emily sat at the other end of the table and watched what it did to each of them. Luke's jaw tightened, but his eyes were steady. The look of a person receiving information they had mostly already guessed, relieved in spite of everything to have it confirmed. Caleb's hands flattened on the table, and Emily saw the tension go through him, but it was different from the panicked flinching she'd grown used to watching. This was a boy bracing not to run, but to hold. Sam sat very still and listened. The way Sam listened to everything with the concentrated attention of someone cataloging and sorting and building a response. Thomas pressed his lips together and looked at the table, and then looked up at his father with an expression so much older than 15 that Emily had to look away for a second. Henry opened his notebook. It was pure instinct. The boy's hand went to his breast pocket without his brain apparently being involved. He caught himself, looked at the notebook, and then looked at Emily, and she gave him the smallest nod, and he opened it and held his pencil ready. And Ben. Ben sat with both hands wrapped around his cup and listened to his father talk about money and drought and land rights with the focused expression of a child who did not understand all the words and understood everything important. When Jacob finished, the table was quiet. Luke spoke first. "How much do we need to cover the operation for the next 2 months if the North cattle have to move south?" Jacob told him. "I've got close to a third of that in wages from the mill," Luke said. "It's not enough, but it's a start." "I can go back to the mill too," Caleb said immediately. He looked at Luke. "You should have told me. I've been asking what I can do for 8 months. Luke looked at his brother. "I know. I'm sorry." The words came out rough and plainly and without decoration, the way hard words come out in families that aren't used to saying them, and Caleb nodded once and looked back at his father, and something between the two of them settled permanently into a different shape. Sam said, "The Henderson cattle operation is bigger than ours. If Clara Henderson is already in contact with the lawyer, maybe there's a way to coordinate the legal filing so it covers multiple properties simultaneously. A single filing is easier to dismiss than 4. Everybody looked at Sam. "That's right," Emily said quietly. "That's exactly right." Thomas said, "The Gordon Walsh angle, the newspaper reporter. I can write. I've been—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I've been writing things down, since Ma died. Just things that happened, things I noticed. I don't know if it's any good, but I have dates and details going back 3 years, and some of it might be useful." Emily looked at Thomas with the particular feeling of a person who has just seen something they should have seen sooner. The boy who went behind the barn every afternoon. Not just to grieve, to write. "Thomas," she said, "can you bring me what you have?" He nodded, still looking at his hands, and there was color in his face. Henry said, "I have the supply records, every short delivery, every missing item going back to when I started the notebook. If you want dates and amounts, I have all of it." Jacob looked at his 10-year-old son. "Son," he said, and his voice came out like something pulled from a great depth. "I didn't know you were doing that." "Someone had to," Henry said, and he said it without accusation. Just fact, just the simple reporting of a child who had seen a need and filled it, because that was the kind of child he was. And Jacob reached across the table and put his hand over Henry's, and didn't say anything else because there was nothing else to say. Ben looked at Emily. "What do I do?" he said. Emily thought about it seriously because Ben deserved to be taken seriously. "You keep doing what you're already doing," she said. "What am I doing?" he said. "Reminding everyone what we're fighting for," she said. Ben considered this. Then he nodded with the gravity of a boy who had just been given an important assignment. The table erupted. Not an argument in motion. Luke and Caleb leaning together over numbers. Sam asking Jacob specific questions about the cattle movement. Thomas going upstairs and coming back 10 minutes later with a battered journal that he placed on the table in front of Emily with slightly trembling hands. Henry spreading his notebook open beside it and beginning to cross-reference dates. Jacob answering questions from 4 directions at once with an aliveness in his face that had not been there since Emily arrived. She sat at her end of the table and watched it happen and felt something settle in her chest that was too large and too quiet to be called relief. This was what a family looked like when it finally stopped protecting itself from itself. Clara Henderson came Thursday as promised, bringing the Garber widow and a folder of documents that represented 11 years of a cattle operation being deliberately dismantled. Ruth Patterson arrived an hour later with Ed's sworn statement and the original land grant record she had quietly retrieved from the county seat in person rather than by mail. By midday, Emily's kitchen table was covered with papers, and 4 women were working through them with the focused efficiency of people who had been waiting a long time for someone to hand them a task. Sam rode to Laramie on Saturday morning with everything: the compiled sworn statements, the documented pattern of interference, Henry's supply records, Thomas's journal extracts with dates and details, and a letter from Emily to Clara's brother-in-law in Cheyenne laying out the case in plain language. He came back Sunday evening and said the letters were sent. Now they waited. The waiting was the hardest part. Briggs did not move again immediately, which was somehow worse than if he had. The silence felt deliberate, the silence of a man who knew something was in motion and was deciding how to respond. Jacob checked the North Creek every morning and came back each day to report that the dam was still in place and the water level in the North Trough was still dropping. He moved the first group of cattle south on Wednesday, crowding the pasture, as he'd feared watching the animals with the tight-eyed attention of a man counting losses before they happened. Luke stopped sleeping again, which Emily could tell by the way he appeared in the kitchen before 5 every morning. But he wasn't hiding numbers now. He sat at the table and drank his coffee and talked to her not every morning, not about everything but enough. Enough to matter. It was on one of those early mornings, 12 days after Sam's ride to Laramie, that Jacob came in from the pre-dawn check of the cattle and found Emily and Luke both at the table and sat down heavily and said, "I owe all of you an apology." Luke looked up. "Not just about the money," Jacob said. "Not just about Briggs." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at the table. "After your mother died, I stopped. I know I did. I kept the ranch going, and I kept the table fed, and I told myself that was enough, because I didn't know how to do the other part. I didn't know how to talk to you about her. I didn't know how to say—" He stopped. "I was afraid that if I said it out loud it would become real in a way I couldn't come back from." Luke was very still. "She's real whether I say it or not," Jacob said. "She was your mother and she was my wife, and I should have been able to say that to you. I should have been able to let you see that I was hurting too, instead of just working. Always just working." He looked at Luke directly. "You shouldn't have had to carry the mill shifts alone. Caleb shouldn't have felt invisible. Thomas shouldn't have spent 2 years going behind the barn to have his feelings in private. Those things are on me." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Luke's expression had gone through 4 things in about 5 seconds, and had arrived somewhere that was not quite composure, and not quite grief, and not quite relief, but carried all 3 of them at once. "We should have told you things too," Luke said. It's not just you, Pa." "You're 19, Jacob said. "I'm your father. The weight of the thing lands where it lands." Luke looked at his coffee cup. "She would have made you say this a lot sooner," he said, and his voice came out rough. "Yeah," Jacob said. "She would have." "Emily made you say it instead," Luke said. Jacob looked across the table at Emily, who had been sitting very quietly and trying to occupy as little space as possible in what was not her moment and not her confession. "Emily made it possible to say it," Jacob said. "There's a difference." Emily looked at the table. "There is," she said quietly. "And for the record, I was just following the recipe." Luke let out a sound that was startled and genuine, and wholly unguarded, a real laugh, sudden and short, the kind that escapes before you can decide whether to let it. Jacob looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, and could not fully name something open and quiet that was not the careful neutrality he wore in public, or the flat exhaustion he wore at the end of long days, but something that lived underneath both of those, and had apparently decided in the early morning quiet of his own kitchen that it was finally safe to be seen. Emily looked away first. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. She got up to start the biscuits. 2 days later, the letter came from Cheyenne. The letter from Cheyenne was 2 pages long and written in the precise, unhurried hand of a man who understood that every word he put on paper might eventually be read aloud in a courtroom. Clara Henderson's brother-in-law, a lawyer named Robert Aldis, had read everything Sam carried to Laramie. He had read Henry's supply records and Thomas's journal and the sworn statements from 4 families, and the land office letters, with their careful bureaucratic language designed to sound routine, while describing something that was not routine at all. He had read all of it, and his letter said this: what Emily had built was not just a complaint. It was a case. He used that word. A case. Emily read the letter twice at the kitchen table before she looked up. Jacob was watching her. "He's filing a formal complaint with the Federal Land Office in Washington," she said. "Coordinated interference with water rights documentation, conflict of interest in land office administration, and what he's calling a pattern of commercial coercion across multiple properties." She looked at Jacob steadily. "He needs one more thing. He needs someone willing to speak on record to the territorial newspaper before the filing so that Briggs can't suppress the complaint at the county level before it reaches federal review." "The Gordon Walsh angle," Jacob said. "Yes." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me to put my name in a newspaper." "I'm asking someone to put their name in a newspaper," Emily said carefully. "It doesn't have to be you. Clara will. Ruth will. But a rancher, a man who's been here 20 years with roots in this valley, carries more weight than a woman who's been here 2 months," Jacob said, not unkindly. "Yes," Emily said. "That's the truth of it." Jacob looked at the letter. He looked at the table. He looked out the window at the ranch that his hands had built over 20 years, and that his wife had helped him build, and that his sons had grown up on, and that a man in a land office in Red Willow was trying to take from him through paperwork and patience. "Set up the meeting with Walsh," he said. Emily wrote to Gordon Walsh that afternoon. She sent the letter from Laramie with Sam, who was becoming, without anyone formally deciding it, the family's most reliable courier. Walsh wrote back within 4 days, fast enough that Emily understood he had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, and agreed to come to the Turner Ranch the following Thursday. The days between felt stretched thin. Briggs moved on the Tuesday before Walsh's visit. Not dramatically. Briggs never moved dramatically. He sent a man out to the Turner Ranch, a lawyer of his own, a smooth-voiced man named Cutter, who arrived in a good coat and tied his horse at the post with the particular confidence of someone who believed money made him welcome everywhere. Jacob met him on the porch, and Emily stood just inside the door and listened. Cutter said his client was prepared to make a final offer on the Turner property. Given the current administrative review of the water rights and the demonstrated difficulty of maintaining operations under present conditions, his client felt the offer was generous. He named a figure. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "Tell your client," Jacob said, "that the answer is the same as it was 18 months ago." Cutter's tone didn't change. "Mr. Turner, I'd encourage you to consider carefully. The review process could take considerably longer than estimated. Your operational position in the meantime is my business," Jacob said. "Not yours and not his." "Mr. Turner." "You came a long way for a short conversation," Jacob said. "I'd get back on the road before dark if I were you." Cutter left. Jacob came inside and stood in the kitchen and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he said, "He's going to move before Walsh gets here. I'd bet on it." "What kind of move?" Emily said. "I don't know. But that visit wasn't about the offer. The offer was an excuse." Jacob looked at her. "He wanted to see how close we are to breaking." "What do you think he decided?" "I think he decided we're not broken, but we're close," Jacob said. "And I think he's going to try to close the distance before Thursday." He was right. Wednesday morning, Dex came in from the south pasture at a dead run, which Dex had never done in the entire time Emily had been at the ranch, and told Jacob that 3 sections of the south fence line were down and the cattle were out. Every able body on the ranch spent 12 hours getting the cattle back in and the fence repaired. All 6 boys worked from before sunrise until after dark. Jacob worked beside them without stopping. Emily managed the house, kept food and water coming, and watched the clock with the specific dread of a person watching a deadline move. By the time the last fence post was set and the last animal was back in the south pasture, it was past 9 at night, and every person on the Turner Ranch was exhausted to the bone. Luke came in last, dropping into a kitchen chair with his hat in his hands, and said to nobody in particular, "That fence didn't fall on its own." Nobody contradicted him. 3 sections at once, Sam said. Same side, even spacing. That's not weather. Can we prove it? Emily said. No, Luke said flatly. Same as we can't prove the dam and can't prove the supply interference. He looked at Emily. He's very careful. He's been careful the whole time, Emily said. That's why the pattern matters more than any single incident. Walsh comes tomorrow. We give him the whole picture. If Briggs finds out Walsh is coming, Caleb started. He may already know, Emily said. We sent the letter from Laramie, but Briggs has eyes in more places than we've accounted for. She looked around the table at 7 exhausted faces. It doesn't change what we do tomorrow. It changes how fast we do it. Thomas said quietly, I want to talk to Walsh myself. Emily looked at him. Not instead of Pa, Thomas said quickly. With him? I have 3 years of documented incidents in that journal, and I can speak to them clearly, and I'm 15 years old. He paused. A 15-year-old boy telling a reporter what he watched happen to his family is harder to dismiss than a land rights filing. The table was quiet. He's right, Sam said. Jacob looked at his 3rd son, the quiet one, the one who went behind the barn, the one who had been writing things down for 3 years because it was the only way he knew to make sense of them. And something moved through Jacob's face that was part recognition and part grief, and part a pride so fierce it had nowhere to go, except to sit in his chest and burn. You'll talk with me, Jacob said. Both of us. Thomas nodded. The color in his face was high, and his jaw was set, and he looked in that moment so much like his mother in the photograph above the fireplace that Emily had to look away. Gordon Walsh arrived Thursday morning in a wagon with a battered leather satchel and the alert, watchful eyes of a man who had spent 20 years listening to people tell him things they were afraid to say out loud. He was younger than Emily had expected, mid-30s, lean, with a quick manner that was not aggressive, but was absolutely attentive. He shook Jacob's hand at the door and looked around the kitchen table at the assembled family and the 2 neighboring women who had also come. Ruth Patterson and Clara Henderson, seated side by side with their documentation stacked in front of them like armor, and said, I'm going to need several hours and a great deal of coffee. Emily put the pot on. What followed was the most important conversation the kitchen had ever held. Walsh asked precise questions and wrote fast and listened harder than he asked. Jacob talked about the original refusal to sell and what followed. Ruth talked about the land office letter and the missing survey records. Clara talked about the cattle contract and Briggs's stake in the buying operation. Henry, without being asked, placed his supply notebook on the table in front of Walsh and walked him through 12 months of documented short deliveries with the focused clarity of a boy who had been keeping careful records for exactly this moment without knowing it. Walsh looked at Henry's notebook for a long time. He looked at Henry. He said, How old are you, son? Henry said 10. Walsh looked back at the notebook and wrote something in his own. Then Thomas set his journal on the table. Walsh read for 20 minutes without speaking. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Emily could hear the younger boys in the yard. Ben's voice carrying above the others, ordinary and bright. The sound of a child who did not yet know that the direction of everything was being decided at a table 30 feet away. Walsh set the journal down. He looked at Thomas. You wrote all of this yourself? Yes, sir. These dates. The water access changed the supply pattern. The fence this week, you recorded these contemporaneously, at the time they happened. I didn't know why I was writing them down, Thomas said steadily. I just knew that things were happening and nobody was saying them out loud, so I wrote them instead, in case it ever mattered. Walsh looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said, It matters, and went back to his notes. He stayed until mid-afternoon. When he stood to leave, he shook Jacob's hand again and then turned to Emily and said, "You put this together." "These families put it together," Emily said. "I just helped them find each other." Walsh looked at her with the expression of a man filing something away. "The story runs Sunday," he said. "If Briggs tries to interfere with the publication, that attempt itself becomes the story." He looked at Jacob. "File your federal complaint Monday. The letter and the newspaper story together, that's two simultaneous pressures from two different directions. He can manage one. He can't manage both." He drove away. Emily stood on the porch and watched his wagon go, and felt the particular suspended feeling of a thing set in motion that could no longer be recalled. Jacob came and stood beside her. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she said. They stood there in silence for a moment. Not the closed-off silence of the early weeks, but a different kind. The silence of two people who have been through enough together that they don't need to fill every space with words. "Emily," Jacob said. She waited. "Whatever happens with Briggs," he said. "Whatever the outcome, you should know that what you've done here—" He stopped. Started again, which was unusual for him. Jacob Turner was not a man who started sentences twice. "What you've done for this family, for my sons, that's separate from the Briggs business. That's—" He looked at the yard, at the barn, at the fence line where his boys were working. "That's not something that can be undone regardless of how the rest goes." Emily looked at the same view. "Good," she said simply. The story ran Sunday. It ran on the front page of the Cheyenne Territorial Gazette, under Walsh's byline, with the headline, "Pattern of Land Coercion Alleged Across Wyoming Valley. Multiple ranch families speak out." It named Briggs directly. It cited the land office letters, the water rights review, the supply interference, the cattle contract cancellation. It quoted Jacob Turner by name. It quoted Ruth Patterson and Clara Henderson. It referenced a journal kept by a 15-year-old boy over 3 years and a supply record maintained by a 10-year-old child. By Monday morning, the federal land office in Washington had received Robert Aldis's complaint. By Tuesday, the territorial governor's office had received 3 separate letters from county residents requesting an investigation into land office administration in Red Willow. By Wednesday, Walter Briggs had retained a lawyer of his own in Cheyenne. Not Cutter, someone larger, which told Emily everything she needed to know about whether the pressure was working. The dam on the North Creek came down on Thursday. Nobody admitted to removing it. Nobody needed to. Jacob rode out at first light and came back to the house and walked into the kitchen where Emily and Luke and Sam were at the table and said, "The water's flowing." And the 3 of them sat there for a moment in a silence that was the complete opposite of every silence that had come before it. "That's him blinking," Luke said. "Yes," Emily said. The Federal Review took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, the Turner Ranch operated the way it had not operated in over a year. Not easily, not without strain, but together. Luke came home from the mill for the last time on a Friday evening and told Jacob he was done with the night shifts, that the numbers had shifted enough that he didn't need them anymore, and Jacob sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "I should have known sooner. I should have seen what you were doing and told you to stop." Luke looked at his father and said, "We're not doing this alone anymore. That's what matters now." Jacob reached across the table and gripped his son's shoulder, and neither of them said anything else, and neither of them needed to. Caleb started coming to Emily with questions, practical ones at first, household things, and then wider ones about the Briggs situation, about the legal process, about how Emily had known what to look for. She answered every question straight. He started sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, not in the tight, braced way he used to sit, but loosely, comfortably, like a boy who had decided the room was safe. One evening, he said out of nowhere, "I didn't think you were going to stay." Emily looked at him. "When you first came," he said, "I figured you'd see what a mess it was and leave inside a month." She said, "I told your brother Ben I didn't plan to." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm glad you meant it," and went back to what he was doing, and Emily sat with that sentence for the rest of the evening and felt it settle somewhere permanent. Sam's idea about the coordinated legal filing proved correct. Aldous had filed on behalf of all 4 families simultaneously, which made the complaint impossible for Briggs to address through local connections. A single family could be pressured, delayed, worn down. 4 families with a federal filing and a newspaper story and a governor's office taking an interest were something else entirely. The federal land inspector arrived in Red Willow in the 5th week. He spent 3 days reviewing land office records and interviewing property owners and examining documentation, and on the 3rd day he sat down with Jacob Turner and Robert Aldous in the Red Willow surveyor's office and went through every transaction Walter Briggs had executed in the valley over the previous 2 years. Henry's supply notebook sat on the table. Thomas's journal sat beside it. The 4 families' sworn statements were there. The pattern that Emily had built, one conversation at a time in kitchens and on wagon rides and at a table covered with papers, while the women of the valley sorted through the wreckage of what had been done to them, lay in front of a federal official who had the authority to do something about it. The findings were released on a Friday in early spring. 3 of Briggs's land acquisitions were found to have involved improper use of land office documentation. His conflict of interest in the cattle buying operation was referred for separate investigation. The administrative review of the Turner water rights was dismissed as procedurally improper. The North Creek access was formally confirmed as Turner property. Briggs paid substantial fines. He resigned from his position at the land office under pressure he did not wait to have formally applied. Within 3 months, he had sold his own holdings in the valley and left Wyoming entirely. Ruth Patterson told Emily with a satisfaction she made no effort to contain that Briggs had been seen in Colorado apparently attempting a similar scheme in a different valley. Emily said she hoped the ranchers there were as stubborn as the ones in Wyoming. Spring came across the valley the way spring always came, not all at once, but gradually, insistently, the cold giving ground inch by inch to something warmer and more insistent. The north pasture cattle came back from the south. The creek ran full and clear. The ranch breathed again. It was on an evening in late April, ordinary in every way, except that by now, ordinary had a warmth to it that it hadn't had before. That Jacob came inside from the day's work and found the kitchen empty and followed the sound of voices to find all 6 boys in the back room at the end of the hall, with the door half closed, clearly engaged in something they did not want observed. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. Emily was at the stove. She met his eyes and shook her head slightly. Leave them, and he stood there with the uncertainty of a man who was still learning that some moments were not his to manage. "What are they doing?" he said quietly. "I don't know exactly," Emily said. "They've been in there for 2 weeks, every evening after supper." Jacob looked at the closed door down the hall. "Should I?" "No," Emily said. He sat down at the table and waited. Ben appeared 20 minutes later, standing in the kitchen doorway with sawdust in his hair and paint on both hands, and an expression of someone carrying a secret so big it had become physically uncomfortable. He looked at Jacob. He looked at Emily. He looked back at Jacob. "Can you come?" he said. "Both of you." The back room had been unused since Emily arrived, storage space. Broken equipment, the accumulated overflow of a household that had not had enough hands to deal with everything. She had noticed the boys going in and out of it, but had not asked, had understood from the 3rd or 4th evening that asking would ruin something, and so had simply let it be. She was not prepared for what they had done with it. The room had been cleared, cleaned and fixed. Plaster patched floor swept clean. The broken shutter on the window replaced with a working one. A small table sat against one wall with a simple chair. A shelf had been mounted and held neatly arranged the things that had been on the kitchen shelf for 6 months. The blue tin, the jars of dried herbs, and in the place of honor at the center, carefully placed on its own small stand that Henry had clearly built specifically for the purpose, the recipe book. Above the door, mounted on a piece of wood that Thomas had planed smooth and painted, and Luke had carved into, hung a sign. Mom's room. Emily stood in the doorway and looked at it. Ben pressed in beside her and took her hand and held it in both of his. "We didn't want you to think it was about replacing her," he said. "Luke said we had to say that first. It's not about replacing her." "We know she's our first, Ma," Caleb said from the back of the group. His voice was rough, and he was clearly fighting to keep it level. "We're not, we know that, but he stopped. "You stayed, and that means something." Thomas said quietly, "We wanted you to have a place that was yours." Emily stood in the doorway of the room 6 boys had built for her over 2 weeks of evenings, while she kept her back turned at the stove and asked no questions, and she felt something move through her that was too large for the word grateful and too specific for the word love, though it contained both the feeling of a person who left everything behind and walked into the unknown and found at the end of that walk something she had not let herself know she was looking for. She looked at the sign. She looked at Ben's hands wrapped around hers. She looked at Luke, standing at the back of the group with his arms crossed and his jaw set, in the particular way of a young man who has done something tender and is bracing for the exposure of it. And she thought about that first morning at the kitchen table, the numbers on the paper, the 8 months of night shifts, the exhausted boy who had been carrying everything alone. And she thought about how far he had come from that, how far they had all come. She looked at Jacob. He was standing to her left, slightly behind the boys, and on his face was the expression she had seen once before, that open, unguarded thing that lived underneath the flatness and the exhaustion, the thing that had decided on a cold morning in the kitchen that it was safe to be seen. It was more visible now. It had been getting more visible for weeks. "Jacob," she said, and her voice was steady. He stepped forward out of the group of boys and stood in front of her. And he was not a man who made speeches, she had learned that long ago. But he looked at her directly the way he had looked at her from the beginning, with the kind of honesty that didn't require decoration. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the Briggs business, not for the household, for—" He looked at his sons behind him, all 6 of them standing in a room they had built with their own hands. "For making them able to do this." "They were always able," Emily said. "They just needed someone to stay long enough for them to trust it." Ben tugged her hand. "So you're staying," he said. "For always." Emily looked at the sign above the door. She looked at the recipe book on its small stand. The handwriting of 3 generations of women who had fed people and loved people and held things together. And she thought of her own name, written into that lineage, not replacing anyone, simply continuing it. She looked at Ben. "I'm staying," she said. Jacob raised his coffee cup that evening at the supper table in the same kitchen where a woman had once cooked a dead woman's recipe and given 6 silent boys back the sound of their own voices, and he said simply, "To the woman who came here as a stranger and became the heart of this home." 6 cups went up. Emily looked around the table at Luke, who had come home from the mill for the last time. At Caleb, who had stopped flinching. At Sam, who was already thinking 3 steps ahead. At Thomas, who had turned grief into testimony and testimony into justice. At Henry, whose notebook now tracked abundance instead of shortage. And at Ben, who had never stopped believing that staying mattered and had been right from the beginning. She had come west with 1 suitcase and no illusions, and a letter that contained a single instruction and no promises. She had not come looking for a family. But she had built one supper, 1 conversation, 1 honest word at a time, and it had built her back in return. She raised her cup, and she was home.